All right, good day. So, as a quick review, last week we left off talking briefly about setting your scene, the who, what, when, and where. So, who, subject, person, animal, object, and the setting, the when and the where. We also talked about adjusting your tools just a little bit. So, these will come into play a little bit later. And determining your purpose, your why. So are you trying to make something that's more evocative or something that's more practical? Now, these are all things that you can consider for any kind of photography, but this particular week, we're going to be focusing on landscape photography. And if you recall, I had you guys go out and take a walk. Now, if you need to take a couple extra photos to kind of pad what you've done, feel free, but listen to this first to see if there's anything else that you might need to do. So this week, and I'm going to start the presentation here, we are talking about phase 2, or composing the photograph. So phase 1 is kind of setting everything up, getting it ready to go, making sure you're taking pictures at the right time and place. This part is making sure you're capturing what it is that you want to capture. So the rules of composition that we generally tend to follow, number 1 is the rule of thirds. And this is something that if you've taken any drawing or painting classes, you should recognize because it's an equally important thing in any kind of visual composition. Some other things, and these are the ones we're going to focus on this week, are keeping the horizon straight, moving the horizon, and using the foreground to balance the background. Next week, we're going to talk about isolating the focal point, filling the frame, using lines, symmetry, and patterns, and the fact that every picture tells a story. So, rule of thirds. This is super key, very important. If you want to write anything down, make sure that you star, underline, bold, whatever, the rule of thirds. It's breaking the photo down into 9 equal parts. And your points of interest should be located at the cross sections. This helps to guide the viewer through your piece and create interesting compositions. So if you have something that has a very large point of interest that doesn't necessarily fall on one cross section, you should also try to line them up with the lines of your grid. So notice how this signpost is almost exactly lined up with this side grid line. You can turn on this grid view on your camera if you want it to be there so you can really line it up. Otherwise, if you can just visualize it and imagine it, it'll help you to take more instinctual pictures and make sure that your photographs that you take are much more natural, right? So next up, we've got some examples. You can do it on both landscape orientation photos and portrait orientation photos. Hopefully these guidelines help you to think about where your important pieces of information in your photographs are. The next thing we're going to talk about is the horizon line. So the first thing you want to try to do is keep the horizon line straight. It seems obvious, but it's a kind of common mistake. If you take it in vertical pictures, right, our portrait orientation photos, it's less obvious because the line is shorter. In our horizontal or landscape orientation pictures, it's very obvious. And those askew lines really affect the feel of the photograph. Now, when you think about it, hopefully you're seeing my hands, when our pictures are just a little off kilter, it kind of makes us feel like we're falling off the edge of the photograph because we're used to seeing the horizon line straight. So if it's in a digital photo, like ours are, then you can adjust the image on your computer or in your photo editing software on your iPad or phone or whatever it is you're taking pictures with. So again, here's some examples. So in our portrait orientation, notice how the horizon line is so much shorter than in our landscape orientation photos. It's what makes it less obvious, but it's still important. The next thing is moving the horizon line. And again, we've already talked about keeping it straight, but this one determines where it's lined up on the photograph. Now, this rule is actually very closely related to the rule of thirds. So try to avoid putting your horizon line in the middle of your picture, as that tends to be really boring. Put it on the upper third if you're focusing on the foreground. Okay, so if your horizon line is higher, your audience will see more of the foreground. Put your horizon line on the lower third if you're focusing on distant landscape or the sky. Now, these are guidelines. I will be talking more about experimenting, but the other thing is digital is free. Try as many different things as you can and find what speaks to you. So in here, horizon on the upper third. So again, if we imagine the split into those 9 equal parts, our focus is mostly on this little area in the foreground instead of being on the background. Same thing with this one. We're focusing on all these crazy lines in the sand rather than being focused on these hills in the back. What's the focus in this one? Or how about here? These examples have the horizon on the lower third. So these are the ones where we're focusing on the sky or the background, or in general things above the horizon line. The last one we're going to talk about today is using the foreground to balance the background. So when you're photographing something off in the distance, you want to try to get something up close in the foreground that's interesting as well. It'll provide a sense of balance, and it'll give us a path to move through in your picture. The next thing is that it adds a sense of depth and perspective so that we can really see how far apart these things are. Right? And it makes your picture that much more interesting because instead of just being one flat thing to look at, there's multiple layers to go through. As viewers, we tend to go to the foreground first, and then our eyes go into the distance. So especially if what you're focusing on is in the background, you want a little bit of something to get us into the picture and then pull us back through it. Take a moment to look at these. Try to think of what you think in the foreground is balancing the background. So in this one, we might say that the boats are balancing the building. This one is more that we're balancing this person below the horizon line with this person above the horizon line. But then again, we have this structure pulling us back into the distance because we have a feeling that these are connected. So this really gives us a sense of how far away that mountaintop is. In this one, we have these cut trees kind of balancing with this tree that pulls us into the background. We have these two structures, the lion sculpture and the aqueduct. And then in this one, if you look really closely, we have this post, but way back in the background, there's this little tree guy. You might need to look really close to see it, but it's kind of a cool thing once you notice it. So for this week, I'm going to go back a few pages just so we can go back over the 4 main things that we're talking about. So the rule of thirds. Key, important, number one, star, crown, whatever. It's the most important thing that we're going to consider. Keep the horizon line straight. Move the horizon line away from the center. And use your foreground to balance your background. Hopefully these make sense, and we will talk some more next week.